Our next speaker today is Walter Ansel, who I guess I first met Walter when you was going to college, I think. And then Walter went boat building, and he went. You were dragger fishing for a while. You built a dragger. He's been on and off working at Mystic Seaport as a shipwright, as an instructor. He did a stint over as a teacher over to Iris, I believe. And he's not the head shipwright at Mystic Seaport. He carefully says he's the senior shipwright, which means that he gets to work and doesn't have to do quite so much of the administrative stuff. Would that be a fairly accurate presentation? Anyway, some years ago, Mystic took on the Roann, which was a Newbert Wallace dragger. Some years after that, Penobscot Marine Museum took on the Jacob Pike. Unfortunately, 2009 happened, so we ended up finding another home for the Pike, and she's actually now working as a lobster carrier right down there out of Rockland. But we had hoped to put her into educational use and had all these good things, but 2009 was not a good year. So what we're going to look at here is Newbert Wallace. Some of you folks were down at Newbert Wallace yesterday, a.k.a. Lyman Morris. It's different. And I think we'll let Walter talk a little bit about Newbert Wallace and talk about the fairly massive reconstruction job that he led down at Mystic, which also gave you the opportunity to poke into the Newbert Wallace history pretty well. Yep. Thank you, Walter.
Well, this is the lady of the hour here, Roann. This picture was taken in the mid-90s when she was almost 50 years old. She had fished straight through from the time she was built in 1947, mostly out of Point Judith, Rhode Island. And I went to the commercial fisheries school in the late 70s at University of Rhode Island and kept hearing about the Westcott family, which was this powerhouse fishing clan, three brothers that were phenomenal fishermen, really hard drivers and top earners. And Roann's name kept coming up. There was the Roann, the Bob and Barry, and the Suzanne. All boats of the same Albert Condon design, modified slightly, but all built in Thomaston, Maine by Newbert Wallace. And these boats were absolutely loved by the fishermen. They brought forth pretty strong emotions from them. And we were very fortunate at Mystic Seaport to be able to acquire Roann in 1997, and she basically fished the week before she came, steamed up the river to Mystic from Point Judith with nets on deck and flounders still stuck in the stanchions, oilskins down below, canned food in the galley. And Mystic had never acquired an artifact that was that complete, that recent, all the players living. I mean, the fishermen basically stepped off of her onto their state-of-the-art steel stern trawler with a net reel on it. So we were able to get fantastic oral histories from the owner and crew. Now, I think in Mystic, one thing that we didn't realize was that there was quite a responsibility that went with the ownership of this girl, which was the darling of the port. And we'd have these old boys drive into the shipyard, not bothering to buy a ticket to the museum or anything like that, and just park right there in the middle of the yard and, where's our boat? So that was pretty interesting. During the rebuild, which happened 2004 to 2008, I was called by National Fishermen, and they wanted a quote from me about the project. And I sort of said that she was all used up. And that was a big mistake, because I got in trouble for that. But just to give you an idea of the loyalty and emotion and love for this vessel that was that they had in Point Judith. So I'm going to talk a bit about Roann's rebuild, but also I have a number of pictures from the Wallace family from their yard, and I've got some great sequential pictures of construction of these vessels. So Newbert Wallace, almost yacht-like, these Eastern rig draggers. She was designed by Albert Condon, who set up his shop down in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and he had apprenticed as a shipwright, really knew the business well, knew wooden vessel construction, and if you look at her, she's just massively built, designed basically into 3 different compartments. We've got a fish hold in the middle for 55,000 pounds of ice fish, engine room after that, and forecastle with living quarters for 6 men. Extremely deep draft, very safe, ballasted with concrete and scrap metal, so that you could run in all sorts of conditions. Light vessel, still have her safe, with maybe a lot of fuel burned off. Deck loading with large tows of fish and junk, and you know that the center of gravity is still in a reasonable spot, and you've got a safe riding arm. She had auxiliary sails on her when she was built, and understand they were never put on because the crew didn't like the wind blowing down the back of their necks. All right, the builder. This is Roy Wallace, and his career pretty much paralleled Harvey Gamage's. He was born in 1899, and he lived until lived 92 years, I guess. And he started out at the Morse Yard when he was 20, and those formative years, he was an apprentice carpenter, and he was in on building for Dan Mullins, really the first designated or pure diesel dragger for the Port of New Bedford, and her name was the Mary. So Roy Wallace was right there at the beginning of the development of the offshore side trawler, and the Mary had a very primitive 60-horse engine in her. They hauled back with ropes wrapped around capstan heads. The Hathaway reel winch with wire hadn't been invented yet. I guess she was quite a test platform. They ripped 3 pairs of gallows frames out of her the first couple of years. It was, the amount of fish out there was just staggering. She, I've got a few numbers right here. She cost $22,000. Her construction cost in 1921, and yet the first 2 trips she stocked $7,800. Pretty amazing. And weight-wise, I heard that she was landing 23,000 pounds routinely a trip. So imagine towing a very primitive small net, using wooden trawl doors to keep the mouth of the net open, and very, very primitive navigating techniques. Basically, you go out, think you can fish in an area, drop an anchor in a buoy, tow off different directions of the compass points, pull the net, and hope you don't rip up. But those guys routinely went through 4 nets a day in the early years because they really didn't know where the hangs or wrecks were. So,
how many fish were they catching?
With the Mary, I think they were just going for ground fish at the time, haddock, cod, yellowtail flounder. This is Roy in his later years. He's cutting a rabbet in a stern post for planking. It's a real interesting place in the vessel. There's a tuck right there. You see the frames running down at about 45 degrees, so there's a tremendous amount of twist. He's using a gouge to rough out the rabbet first, and then he'll probably go in with a larger flat chisel and knock it down, making good space for the end of the plank to lay in there. This is Ray Wallace, Roy's son, who took the yard over in the 70s and ran it till the end, which is about 1985. What's really interesting is Ray is running the on-site sawmill, and I tell you, it's a great luxury to have your own timber in log form. We do this in Mystic. Be able to saw it to dimension, pick out the shapes and sweeps that you want, and cut it right on site. So that's a real boon for a small shipyard. This is 3 generations of Wallaces, shot sometime in the 70s. We've got Ray Jr. on the left, Roy Wallace, Ray Senior, and Leslie. And they were all working together sort of in the last years of the yard. And like I said, I believe this was about 1975 or so. Uncompromising quality at a fair price. That was the Newbert and Wallace mantra, and their boats were really well respected, and owners hung on to them for a long time, and they carefully vetted the next owners before they sold them. First vessel that Newbert and Wallace built. Now Herb Newbert, the partner, was less well known. He ran the sawmill and handled the books, and he never wanted his photograph taken. So I don't have a picture of Herb Newbert, but he was part of the partnership. And he and Roy Wallace met at Snow Shipyard building vessels during World War II, and they decided to team up and get together. They went back to Gray's boatyard in Thomaston and built this Annie M. Jackson. She was their first Eastern rig, also was a smack for carrying lobsters too. And they did her, and then they moved down the street and started their own yard on the St. George River where Lyman Morse is today. This is a good story. This Eugene H. and the Ethel C., these two, they were built in 1944. A fellow named Ram Philbrick was doing very well as a vessel owner up here. So he went to Roy Wallace and said, "Roy, I got a great captain. He just lost his boat to the U.S. government. They needed a dragger for anti-submarine patrol. So they took his vessel, the St. George. I want to build a new vessel for this Captain Coffin." So he gave Wallace a deposit, and Wallace started the boat. Captain Coffin came in and said, "Roy, I want to order a dragger." And well, they hadn't talked to each other, and they both bought Albert Condon plans of the same boat. So Wallace was building this one dragger, he thought, for both fellas. And then in the middle of it, Captain Coffin came in from a great trip, handed over a check and said, "Why haven't you started my boat yet?" It's a terrible mess. So the Eugene H. and the Ethel C. ended up getting built at the same time. Now these Condon designs came either with flat transoms, like you see here, or round sterns. Ray Wallace told me they cost about the same, which is really interesting because the round stern looks a lot more complex, and I'll have pictures of that for you later. But generally, the round stern was preferred because with side trawling, turning to the left was a pretty hard deal to do. Those trawl wires came from the 2 gallows frames, which are the upright steel brackets that you can see here. The tow wires led back here, and if you had to make a left-hand turn, the wires had to go around that corner. Awful hard on the boat. So the round sterns developed to be the preferred type of stern to have. They're also a lot ruggeder around docks and supposedly a better sea stern too. They built quite a few sardine carriers that Wallace modeled himself. They're absolutely gorgeous hulls. I'm sure you all know about the Pauline and the Jacob Pike Ben was talking about. But this Wallace picture here I love because I think it really represents the type very well. There's absolutely gorgeous shear, as you can see, and the hull is just as smooth and as fair as can be. The proportions of the wheelhouse are really fine. And a lot of these boats are still around today because it's relatively easy service. This boat was built in the 40s, I believe the late 40s, and the yard ended up building 8 of them. Captain Bill here is pretty typical of the mid-sized eastern rig. She's 85 feet and fished out of the south side of the Cape, and she was built in 1950. All right, this is a boat built for the Westcott family. Jack Westcott had her built in 1962, the Suzanne. And when I was in school, she was still fishing out of Point Judith, sort of on her, getting pretty close to retirement, but still in fantastic shape. Now, St. George River beyond, set up on a very primitive wooden slipway with bilge blocks and greased planks, basically. They could launch these vessels out of Newbert and Wallace, but they couldn't haul them back out. The way it was done was you build up these bilge blocks, and then the crew would drive wedges all along the bilge and lift the keel off the building blocks, which would be in the center. And then you basically cut a rope and whee, let her go. So 90 tons of oak and iron going down the ways at high speed is pretty exciting. And sometimes it doesn't go as planned. And Jack Westcott, who's still alive, told me he had his little kids and family and everybody on deck. She went thundering down the ways, and the bilge blocks popped out on one side but didn't on the other. Took a hell of a list, so that was in February. So kind of a tough time of year to have that happen. Anyway, they got things straightened out, and there she is, tied up by the Newbert and Wallace Shipyard building. They had to get a diver to pull the blocks out, but she's getting ready to go down to Point Judith. She cost $110,000 delivered. Jack Westcott told me that it was the only dragger he had built that was ready to go. She had a big Caterpillar diesel in her, a D353, or D, yeah. And he got her down to Point Judith, just put her right to work, and I've seen pictures of her iced up within weeks of being finished. You know, he'd come in from a trip and he had ice all over the spars, and pilot house, the ice would be knocked off the glass, so you got just a little spot you could peek out. And I'm looking at her, and I noticed all the paint was flying, it was missing from the hull. And I asked Jack Westcott about that. I said, "What's going on?" He said, well, he starts laughing. He said, "I called Newbert about that." And he said, well, what do you expect? The paint's not going to stay on those planks. The birds were singing, and those planks were in trees only 2 weeks ago. That's how green that lumber is in your boat. I've got a nice sequence of the building of the Katherine. And the Katherine was sort of the last sister to the Roann. She was built in 1975, already a bit of an anachronism at that point because there were a lot of steel stern trawlers with net reels in the business doing awfully well. The side trawlers were only about 75% efficiency compared to the steel stern trawlers, although they were fantastic sea boats, probably a better ride than the steel boats. Anyway, we're in the main shed, and this is 28 years after the Roann was built, but pretty much the same sequence, and I find it absolutely fascinating. Keel down. Now we're going to frame her up with sawn frames. That's a platform right there. The frame futtocks are cut out on a bandsaw, side bolted together, and then stood up. And you can move that platform as needed as you go. Keel painted orange right down here to the right. First couple of frame sections standing up. Crossballs right here to keep the frames from opening up. You worry a lot about alignment at this point, hoping everything is square and true and fair. Shaft log right here, absolutely massive piece of oak with probably about a 5-inch hole bored right through it, which has got to be straight. And that's drifted every which way to Sunday, so it doesn't move around. This piece right here is the horn timber. And the hammer right there will give you an idea of the scale. The stern post would have been right here. This stood up, and this would have been in a round stern boat, so it would have given you that distinctive profile shape. The deck would have landed right here. Many more frames up in place. Looking at the bow, these are stanchions right here that the bulwarks are held up by, and there's several ways to build them. I believe these are incorporated in the sawn frames, double layers that are set up right here. That's Ray Wallace. He's working on that round stern. The timber that we saw on the ground with the hammer on it is right there. It's got a rabbit cut in it. Now, the amazing part about these sterns is that the planking that's going to go on the outside runs up at an angle and fits into a rabbet, into that rim timber. That rim timber was built on the ground very carefully and accurately to the lofted shape, and then stood up and bolted in place. I believe that's a skipper, Dave Sterling, right there. He was a young guy, he was only in his 30s, having this probably $180,000 boat built, if you can imagine what was going on in his head. Nice shot of the inside of the rim timber right there. These are plywood templates for the frames back aft. The only big difference between this vessel and Roann was Roann has steam bent frames, which are a lot faster to put in, so cuts down on construction time and cost, and also gives the hull some flexibility, which the fishermen sort of liked. Here we're spiking oak 1 3/4 planks onto the frames. The fellow on the right's holding a nail set, and that gentleman's driving them with a pin maul, setting them below the surface so you can put a bung on top of the spike. Drilling out the shaft log. Very often your drill bit wanders. You don't really have a lot of control over that, so you drill it undersized, and then you put in a shaft with a fly cutter on it called a boring bar, and that's a bearing right there. You get a bearing on the outside too, and you run the drill back and forth, and hopefully you don't get your shirt tails wound up in the whole thing. I think OSHA shouldn't be around when you're running something like this. We used the boring setup also to do the stern post too when we restored Roann. Deck going down would have been 2-inch pine. Massive hatches built right here out of oak and drifted together. The hatches are very, very vulnerable in these vessels because they have low freeboard and a lot of water on deck all the time. You want to keep them watertight, but also because of the heavy weights that are slamming around on deck, these hatches can get sprung and started, and the seams can leak. So they used a lot of care when they put those together. This is interesting. This is a round stern built up out of chunks of oak. They're all drifted together. That's a little bit of bark and sapwood. We will pretend we won't see that. Massive, massive construction. Deck being laid right here. He's got a clamp to hold the deck plank down, and a lot of times we end up shoring the deck over as hard as we can to get it as tight as possible. Roy Wallace using a wooden plane right there, which is pretty neat, and a fella driving bungs in. Those guys are not youngsters, but they seem to be working hard. Here she is in launch day, and this is a fascinating shot. So she just absolutely fills the shed, and you can see that those two bilge supports I was talking about are on either side, and they're chained across so they don't tip out. So when they launched Suzanne, they must have had something let go in that department. But basically, the wedges are driven in there, and the keel, center part of the keel, is lifted off the ground. And if you're not holding her back, she's going to go. And there she goes, right out of the shed. And that's a great shot. Somebody was outside and took a picture at the same time. This is a restraining line to hopefully keep her from winding up in the neighbor's front lawn on the other side of the river. And there she is, ready to go, to be delivered to the point. She had a V16 Detroit in her, a lot of power. She had steel masts. So the trend in Point Judith was to put more and more power in these things as the years went on. They're basically tractors, so you could pull a bigger net. And as the fishing pressure increased, the volume of catch went down. So that wasn't so much a problem. The winch is right here in front of the wheelhouse. It's driven by a bicycle chain off the front of the engine. The engine would have been right below. And the difference between Katherine and Roann was they added 5 feet in the middle, spread the frames out a little bit, and put a some steel work up forward to give her a little bit of a higher bow. So the yard, Newbert and Wallace built their last big wooden eastern rig, the Columbia, in 1985. She was definitely an anachronism at that point. Built her for Myron Martyr in New Bedford. And Martyr found that he really preferred wooden vessels because by the time you got them paid off after about 15 years, you still had a great vessel that was strong and you could fish hard, whereas the steel boats starting to go through on the plating, and you'd have quite a bit of problems. So he felt that if the wooden vessels were properly built, in middle age, they were worth a lot more than the steel boats. You could see there again the bilge blocking for the launching.
Did you say how thick the planking was?
I don't know what it was on Columbia, but it was 1 3/4 on Roann and Suzanne and Katherine. This is launch day for Roann in 1947. We have Roy and Ann Campbell, and Roann's name was an amalgam of their two names, and she's getting ready to swing the champagne bottle. And I love this picture because it's 28 years before that Katherine picture that I showed you, but it's absolutely the same thing going in. And then look how sweet the shear is on that boat. It's a wonderful picture. And I love the suits that the ladies are wearing up on the bow. A little bit of ribbon. And this is Roann during her fishing years in the 90s when she was in her 50s. The first owner, Roy Campbell, had her built, took her to Vineyard Haven, fished out of Vineyard Haven, unloaded in Woods Hole and New Bedford, and he was hard school, old-time offshore fisherman. If you can imagine fishing this vessel 120 miles east of Cape Cod year-round, he did it. And that's a long way. Didn't have a radio until later, no radar. Fishing with a sounding lead and very primitive navigation equipment. 1953, the boat was almost 6 years old. Roy was laying to in the morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning, on the southeast corner of George's Bank. He was asleep down in the forecastle, up forward. His mate was standing at the wheel. And The mate and engineer were talking, and they noticed a huge wall of water that just rose up on one side of the vessel. And it turned out to be a rogue wave. Well, Roann rode up the face of that wave, but there was an enormous trough on the other side. She fell over 90 degrees. The mastheads went underwater. The cook was asleep forward, got launched completely across the forecastle and ripped out the galley table. Roy thought, this is the end, I'm out of here. He crawls sideways up the ladder and sticks his head out the scuttle. Sees Roann emerging from this wave with water just pouring off her, still sideways, and she popped right back up. The net was wrapped around the spring stay. The nav lights on top of the mast were full of water. The one wheelhouse window got punched out. They had about 3 feet of water in the hold, but that was it. She basically looked after them and popped right back up like a duck. And of course, Roy had to leave the net wrapped around the rigging to show his buddies when he got in. Roy owned her until the early 60s and then sold her into the Westcott clan. And Chet Westcott bought her in 1961, brought her from Vineyard Haven to Point Judith. And Chet was, he was amazing. He was a ground fisherman, draggerman like Roy, but he branched out into other things too. They seined pogies with Roann, and they also sword fished. And the sword fishing rig, which you see on her right here, was used from late summer to early fall. There's a topmast on there. There's actually a fella up there in the crow's nest. You get tremendous visibility from up there. It was a hand harpoon fishery. There's a stand right there, as they called it, and the guy with the harpooner would be standing in the stand with about a 20-foot harpoon. They did use an airplane to spot the fish, and Chet was routinely bringing in the 70s, $9,000 trips, swordfish, all hand harpooned, average about 30 to 35 fish per trip. So these weren't the fish that the longliners are catching now, which they call the puppies. These are fish that were good 400 or 500 pound swordfish. Just to give you an idea of how hard Chet pushed this boat, he landed 900,000, I think it was that. Yeah, he landed 900,000 pounds of ground fish the first year he had the boat, 3.5 million pounds of pogies. It's kind of no surprise there's nothing left out there. Here she is coming up to Mystic Seaport, and as I told you, the came up with nets on the deck and right off of fishing. We had Captain Tom Williams' son Aaron driving the boat and one of the Westcott boys. We had her for 7 years, and she was, the fish hold was pretty well shot. 50 years of ice, fresh water in there, had rotted it out terribly. We knew he had a major rebuild on our hands. So this was the start in the fall of 2004. I was the lead shipwright on the job, and we've got the Detroit V1271, or Maine power plant, coming out right here in this picture. We wanted to lighten her up as much as possible, so we got a local barge dock building company to lift the wheelhouse off. And that was very interesting because if you lift with a large moving crane, which it is because the crane's mounted on a barge, and then Roann could move too, some interesting things happened that we hadn't really planned on. The wheelhouse went up and shot forward about 3 feet, but we're all ready for that. So the little dog, right, there's a cutout plywood dog on the front of the wheelhouse, and that was made by the prisoners in Rockland, and that has always been on the boat. Here she is, hauled out by crane company. We got her weight down to 82 tons, and being hauled out to be put on one of Tom Brownell's trailers. This is at Mystic Seaport, be brought into the big shed, get her major restoration done. To get into the shed, get into the shed, we had to cut the bulwarks off the boat and the stem. They were all shot anyway, but we patterned very carefully, took a lot of measurements, and saved all the pieces. We were very worried about the tumble home and shape, but we recorded that as best we could, and then took her into the main shop. And then the first job in the main shop was knocking out the 22,000 pounds of concrete and iron that was in the bilge, and we knocked the top 3 inches of concrete off, and then an amazing smell came up. It was when she had been a pokey fisherman, all the oil from the menhaden had percolated down through the concrete. And we came home with our work clothes, and our families were just like, "Have you been living in bait barrels?" What? So you could see how worn out she was at this point. A lot of fresh water coming in through the deck, a massive rot in the fish hold. Iron fastened. You're good for about 30, 35 years with an iron fastened vessel in oak, but then you get the tannic acid in the oak reacting with the iron, and everything starts to go south on you. This is the very first steam bent frame we put in the boat. They're basically 2 2x4s, one bent on top of the other. We started in the fish hold, and we were bending the frames off the boat because of their size, and we also had a very small crew. We only had 4 people when we started the rebuild, and we built up later to 7. But we found that we could have a lot more control over the shape. We only had to set this bending table up for one setting, and then we could bend the frames on either side, so we could get 3 pairs out of one setting. One problem that I didn't foresee that we had was, this is the entire fish hold from bulkhead to bulkhead. The surface of the oak planking was so worn and eroded that we were relying on these planks as rib ends to fair things up. We put these frames in and pulled them out to the old planking with temporary bronze or Galvey lag screws. But it turns out when we went to plank later that we found that things were tremendously unfair here. So I think if I was ever to tackle a project like this again, I would remove maybe every 3rd plank and put heavy rib ends on, just like we were doing new construction. Rob Whalen started working on the stem, and Kevin Dwyer on the stern, 2 extremely experienced shipwrights. There's a new stem inner right there. That's a 4-foot piece we were able to take out, clean up, took all the iron out of the boat and replaced it with bronze. That was one of the few changes that we made. This is a frame being bent into a boat with a thing that we invented. It was an Acme screw driven by a 1/2-inch drill. Then again, you wouldn't want OSHA anywhere near this. It was kind of a primitive pushing tool. I'm cutting the rabbet in that curved horn timber piece that, going back to the Katherine's construction, you saw the hammer sitting on. And then there it is going up into place. It's going to lodge under the rim timber right there. Big, big stuff. That's 13 inches thick, one timber. Came out of an old tobacco farm in Suffield, Connecticut. I wound up, while I was lead on this job, doing a lot of timber cruising, going to sawmills, and I took the plans of the vessel with me. And the Sawyers, once you told them what kind of engine it had, they really were on board. They got really excited. So these are all brand new frames, steam bent frames, covered with primer paint right here. And they're starting to put the stringers back in and sealing. And she was a peach basket at one point during the restoration. It's unbelievable how far apart we pulled her. These shear clamps and shelves up here, absolutely massive and bolted, hundreds of bolts. And we ended up making all our own out of bronze, new bolts. There's a lock strake right here. The deck beams are notched over that shelf for incredible strength. The V12 got tore down completely to pieces and rebuilt. And Rob Whalen's lining off planking here. We're using string to get our plank lines, a lot quicker and easier than using battens. And you can move the strings around pretty easily to get things where you want them. Here's the round stern built up. we found that through all those years of fishing, the starboard side, which was her hauling side, had only dropped about an inch or so, or inch and a half. So it was pretty extraordinary that the hull, for as tired as it was, had only lost that much shape. There she is with brand new deck framing, all the stanchions in place. Those are locust. Think about each one of these deck beams being an oak tree, because that's what it was. By the time you loaded the log on the sawmill and sawed it out and got that 6x6, there wasn't much left of the log. Open soft patch right here for taking the engine out of the boat. The winch sits on top, and this square opening right here is for the wheelhouse. Nice light coming into that shop at Mystic. You see the locust stanchions right there. Batten starting to line the shear off and get things fair. Night heads in place. Shear clamps all in place. You see the heavy bilge stringers in this area right here. Rob Whalen working on the lowest bulwark plank. One of the few things we changed was we didn't want the oak drying out terribly and gaps being seen through the bulwarks, so we shiplapped the bulwarks. That was one change. These pine covering boards are notched around each one of these stanchions, and that's a tremendous amount of work to do a nice job of. You've got to be very accurate with your pattern making. We ended up, since the stanchions go through, caulking them is always an issue. Stanchions always leak in big vessels. We ended up wedging the outside and then where we wouldn't be able to reach it in the future and caulking the inside and side faces. There she is coming out of the shed. This was in 2008. And we barely got the stem under the door. We didn't have to chainsaw the shed, which is happens a lot. There you see she's got massive oak sheathing over the sides for protection from hauling the net. And at this point, what's original is the rudder, one piece of deadwood down here, and the keel. Brand new boat. Launch day, you can see that shear is just the neatest thing. We got Chet Westcott's widow to christen the boat when we relaunched her. And boy, it was a fantastic day for all of us. We put a bunch of lead forward to keep her trimmed right. The engine was in, but she was light by the bow quite a bit, so we put about 12,000, 15,000 pounds of lead up forward to hold her down. And there we are coming up the river after sea trialing this August. We had some trouble with the engine. We had to rebuild that a second time. What happened about 3 years ago was funding came through for the Charles W. Morgan, and we got to about 85% on Roann, and we had to stop, and we all went on to the Morgan. But thank heavens for volunteers like Wayne Whalen, who came up with me. He's had Eastern Rig Draggers in his family. He commutes from Cape May, New Jersey, to work in Mystic once a month for 3 or 4 days. And he and 2 other fellows have kept going on her. We shipwrights get pulled in from time to time to do heavier work for them and build parts. But the boat is, Wayne, how would you say, how close are you to being done?
I'd say we're about 92%. Since the boat is launched, everybody assumes the boat is nearly done, but all the mechanical ends, you know, the wiring, the piping, and all the heat systems and so forth, and the rigging and everything, it's taken us another couple of years to go through everything and put the stuff back the original way it was. And one of the funny things is you bring some of this stuff out and you think, gee, just clean it up and paint it. You start going over and you find out it's totally rotten. Well, that means we're making a new one, which is quite a task in some cases, but we're coming along really well with it at this point. And hopefully by this time next year have it completely done.
We're really glad we tackled this project before the market crashed. From a museum standpoint, and the volunteers are crucial for us to keep moving ahead. They're so important, and we're very lucky in being where we are because the systems work on the boat is done by retired engineers from Electric Boat in Groton. So we have fellows that are extremely talented, knowledgeable with hydraulics, wiring, and mechanical work. Just to give you one example of how involved things get, I took every piece of steel off the boat, the spars, over to a sandblaster in Point Judith, who just does dragger spars, and they were there for a couple of months. They got blasted down to bright metal and coated with 6 coats of paint back on the boat. Just one very small part of the whole operation. The galvanized half round around the rails, you can't buy it in the U.S. anymore. We had to import that from England. So a couple examples of the extent that we went to bring her back. We haven't built a program yet because things are tight, but we're hoping to get eventually a skipper and do some marine education program with her. She's certainly offshore capable, very, very safe vessel. And I docked her a couple months ago, and she handles like a dream with that 5-foot propeller and 350 horsepower at your fingertips. Well, thank you very much.
Questions?
You've been talking about working with Coast Guard on big boats and new builds and rebuilds, and with an eye for programming down the way. Have you been working with Coast Guard on? I assume you have. And have there been bumps in the road there?
Yeah, very, very much so. We couldn't put enough bulkheads in her to meet the Coast Guard standards. So right now we're just stuck with a 6-pack, basically 6 passengers plus the crew. There is talk that we could get an exemption because obviously she's extremely safe and capable. So that's in the future. We haven't done that yet. When we built Amistad in 2000, quite a bit of work was done with the Coast Guard to get the 5 bulkheads in the watertight bulkheads on either side of the engine room. They truly were watertight, double diagonal, and all the wiring and plumbing run through tight gaskets in the bulkheads. Also, we had to do an inclining test on her, too. But she was certified for transatlantic with the topmasts and the yards up, which I think is pretty good. Yeah.
What did you just use the lead for ballast, or did you go back with concrete?
We have, that's still pending. We've got the lead in there stacked, but we haven't put the concrete back in. And been a debate. The folks that have been exposed to steel boats hate to see concrete go in, but all the wooden boats we pulled apart, we think that the lime works pretty well with wood and doesn't break it down. So probably what we're going to do is paint the lead with some kind of paint and drop the lead into the concrete as we pour it in the fish hold. It's a nice, clean work surface, and we were thinking that no head in the boat. We're never had one. So we're thinking if we're doing programs, it'd be nice to have some flat surfaces in the fish hold. Maybe take one fish pen and turn that into a head. So.
Go composting.
Right.
Yeah, really, seriously. Composting works great.
Any other questions? One of the things that I really like to see this vessel is that Dana and I were talking the other night when Dana came up to the small craft meet there on Thursday, and you know, with Roann and the Dunton, I mean, you basically got the fishery. There's no place else in the country that you'll see, you know, in 3-dimensional physical form. But basically, we got too good at catching fish, as Ted A. said. You know, and we went out and caught them all, and you can really show it in a very physical, visceral way, the stuff that did the job. You know, the tools that did the job. So there's this huge interpretive piece, you know, getting involved with with conservation, with repopulation of banks, you know, all this kind of stuff. And you've got it right here. You've got Roann, you've got the small dragger that.
You've got a day boat, Western rig, Florence.
Yeah, you've got a little dragger, you've got Roann, and then you've got all sorts of inshore fisheries boats. It's a powerful story, and Mystic's probably the best place that I know of in this country that can tell at least the East Coast side of that story. Thank you, Walter.